we just became very interested, very concerned, worried and curious about what was happening with carers and the people that they look after, not necessarily carers, people living in families where living in lockdown and in the circumstance we've all been living in for the last 18 months or so is really, really difficult. We applied for some funding from the National Institute of Health Research, which is a main funding body in the UK, to help us investigate this. And that's really what this is about. And we're attached to a very important policy research unit at the University of Manchester called, which is called the Older People and Frailty Policy Research Unit, if any of you want to have a look at that. In particular, we're interested in this project. I mean, we have many wider interests for carers of all sorts, but in this project, we are really looking to speak to and survey people who are living with dementia, people who are helping people who live with dementia at home, and find out about their pandemic experiences. And Neil will say something more about that at the end of the session today. We'd love you to get involved with the project. We'll be particularly looking to interview people in 4 areas: Oldham, Doncaster, Derbyshire and Coventry, and we'll be looking to survey people from all parts of the United Kingdom in a little while. So we think it's very, very important to document and give voice to what's been happening with real people, real lives, their day-to-day lives, particularly as we're learning about services that have had to close for very good reasons, but that we're providing lifelines of support. Just to say, in our project, we're not only speaking to people who live at home, supporting people living with dementia, but we're also speaking to local authorities, to social workers, safeguarding leads, to understand the very real challenges from every perspective in this really, really difficult time that we've all been living through. So that's a little bit about our project. I'm going to be monitoring the chat for questions and trying to wrap them up for Neil when he's finished his talk. So please, if you do have questions, put them down there. And if we can't answer them during the session, then we'll see what we can do to put together some Q&A answers afterwards. So back to you, Neil. Thanks everybody for coming. Really great to see you all here.
Super. Thanks ever so much, Debbie. So let's jump straight in. Before we look at the relevant issues, it's worth just me setting out right at the outset that, of course, none of this is legal advice, all right? The main aim of this session really is to provide you with legal information to try and help explain what can sometimes be a pretty daunting process, namely carers assessments. It's not always an opportunity that carers know about or take advantage of. So this is more about giving you the sort of tools that you need to give you a sense of what the benefits might be and what you can expect. But of course, it's not strictly legal advice. All right. So let's have a look at what we're going to cover this afternoon. Essentially, there are 4 things that I'd quite like to do. The first really is just to explain what we mean by a carer, because many people don't see themselves as a carer for perfectly understandable reasons. But this is a sort of legal term in the Care Act. So I want to explain what a carer is, and obviously that then forms the basis for a carer's assessment. I also want to say something about what the law expects of partners in particular. To what extent are we expected in law to provide care to our family members? The second thing relates to the carer assessment. So when to request one, if you do look after or live with someone with dementia, when might you want to consider requesting a carer's assessment and what's involved there, and what you can expect from having made that request. And then what I think is probably the most complicated bit, which is looking at the assessment process itself, because I think as a carer, if you are sort of well versed in the relevant provisions and the guidance that the government has produced around this, then you know the sorts of questions that you can be expected to ask, but also the questions that you might ask of the person that's assessing your needs. So I want to look at how carers' needs are assessed. We are deliberately not really looking at the needs of the cared for person. Okay, and that's the terminology I'm going to use. So I'm going to refer to you, if you like, as the carer, and the person you care for as the cared for person. Now that's a sort of separate webinar in and of itself. Obviously, people's needs can be fairly intertwined. And I'll say something about that later. But really, we're focusing on the needs of the carer, okay, rather than the person they are caring for. So we'll look at how that's assessed. We'll look at how a carer's needs are or might be eligible for services, because not everyone's needs are eligible needs. So we'll look at how that's determined. And then crucially, the process of actually putting together a support plan to meet those assessed eligible needs. What does that look like? What can you reasonably expect? And then finally, in that regard, the financing, if you like, of those services to meet your needs, okay? And then I thought it might be helpful just to finish with a bit of a worked example. So that's the plan for the next 45 minutes or so. We'll probably aim to have a short break, perhaps just before 4 o'clock, and then we'll do a bit of a Q&A session. All these slides, of course, will be made available, and in fact, I can email them out to you afterwards. So let's just start with some of the terminology. What is a carer? And understandably, you know, when you're living with a partner, for example, you might not want to see yourself described as a carer. You might not recognize that this is a caring role that you are undertaking, but the legal definition is important because obviously it's carers that can have a carer assessment. So it's defined in the Care Act, and we are mainly looking at the law in England today. There are separate provisions in Wales. There is a lot of overlap, to be honest. So if you do live in Wales, a lot of this will be equally applicable to the equivalent Welsh provisions, but primarily we're looking at the Care Act of England. And there it defines a carer as an unpaid adult who provides or intends to provide care for another adult with, for example, dementia. Okay, obviously it's not just dementia, but we are focusing very much on carers of those living with dementia. So you are a carer if you provide or you intend to provide care for someone living with dementia. So notice straight away that that's a pretty broad legal definition. The care that you provide or you intend to provide doesn't have to be substantial. It doesn't have to be provided regularly. We're not just talking about sort of physical or practical care. This could be care in the form of emotional support, for example. Care provided to try and keep an even keel within the family home, to try and avoid a crisis. All of that would amount to care. And so far as dementia is concerned, there doesn't need to be a formal diagnosis of dementia before someone is identified as a carer. Okay, so broad definition of carer. Many of us using that definition would be seen as carers under the legislation. And at various points in these slides, you'll see reference to certain paragraphs. There is some legal guidance that accompanies the Care Act, which I can share the link with you in the chat when we have a short break. But just to warn you, it is very, very lengthy. You need to know all about Control F on your computer so you know where to look and you're not swamped by the depth of guidance that's there. But I do refer to particular paragraphs because I think it's very helpful for you to know, first of all, where to look, because this, for example, is where a social worker would be looking for guidance. And so you can all be speaking from the same page. Okay, so that's the definition of a carer. In terms of what does the law expect? Well, they often say, don't they, that charity begins at home. But interestingly, and the UK is fairly unique, I think, in this regard, there is no general legal obligation on us to provide care for a partner or an adult family member. Okay, now, many of us, most of us do, but there's no legal obligation to do so. Just to give you an example of that from the case law, and I'm not going to refer to too much law, but I just think that this case sort of nails the point quite well. In this case, the judge said that a care plan would be unlawful if it assumes a level of input or seeks to impose an unreasonable demand on an unwilling family carer. Okay, so when we start talking about, assessing people's needs, our starting point in a local authority social services department starting point must be that there is actually no legal obligation at all on one partner, for example, to provide care to the other if the other is living with dementia. Okay, so that's the legal position. And it follows from that as a carer, you are perfectly entitled to choose the nature and extent of your caring responsibilities. So that's the law. Like, obviously, ethically, morally, personally, you might feel all sorts of obligations to provide support and care to another. But in law, there is no legal obligation to do so. And the reason I've started with that is because certainly in practice, sometimes we do see professionals assume that, well, if you're married to so-and-so, or if you're a partner of so-and-so, then you should be caring for so-and-so, but that's not the legal expectation here. Okay. And in fact, whenever assessments are done, the assessor should be fully aware that there is no general obligation to provide care to another. And in fact, when we are involved in assessing the needs of the cared for person, so let's say your partner with dementia, looking at their needs as opposed to your needs, that has to be done in what some people refer to as a carer blind format. In other words, when we're identifying that person's needs, we almost have to take you completely out of the equation. It has to be carer blind. We have to ignore the support and care that you've been providing to that person so that we can more sort of independently identify what that person's needs actually are. And then your role comes in much later on. Okay. So we have to have carer blind assessments in that regard. So let's have a look at the assessment itself. We have hundreds of thousands of carers, of course, in England, and many of them have not either wanted or requested or been offered anticipated carers assessments. So obviously you're entitled to refuse one, but why might it be useful to have one? Well, firstly, having your own carer needs assessed by the local authority can help you to identify what your needs are. All too often, I think we might be focusing on the cared for person's needs, and we can sometimes lose sight, actually, of what we need as a carer of someone, let's say, with dementia. So it's useful simply in that regard. It provides a useful, almost like a reality check as to what your needs are in your own independent right. Secondly, and most importantly, in some respects, it provides a way of getting information about what's available to help you. Okay, now I'll talk about funding and commissioning later on. That's the sort of dirty part of this talk, if you like. No one likes to talk about money, really, but obviously money is relevant later on. But in many cases, it's not about funding or commissioning some kind of service. It's simply about knowing what's out there. And that's important whether there's a pandemic or not. Okay, so going through the care assessment process can be useful because it can provide you with access to information as to what services are available. Okay, because you will be coming into contact with people that know, you would hope, what's available in the local community. Thirdly, depending on the type of help and support that might be made available, the outcome of the assessment could well help you in terms of your relationship. And I'm not just talking about your relationship with a partner, but other family relationships as well. It may help in terms of your relationship with an employer if you're in paid employment. And it can also sometimes help with recreational activities. And I'll say something about relaxation therapy later on. And fourthly, of course, going through the carer assessment, identifying what your needs are, which of those needs are eligible for some form of service, depending on your financial situation, it may be that you are, in fact, entitled under the Care Act to funded support to help you meet your needs. Now, I'll say a little bit more about this later. It is possible, of course, to charge under the Care Act for services. It is possible to charge the carer for services, but as I'll explain in more detail, there is a certain false economy, I think, about charging carers in particular, given how much money actually, if you're going to look at it in economic terms, how much money is actually saved by the invaluable role that carers play. All right, so I'll come back to funding towards the end. Now, in terms of the duty, as you can see there, under the Care Act, the local authority is under a duty to offer a carer's assessment if it appears to a local authority that a carer may have need for support. So again, that's a very low sort of legal threshold before a carer's assessment should be offered. It's important that you're, of course, aware that you have a right to request a carer's assessment, but even if you've not requested one, if it appears to a local authority, let's say to a social worker or a social care support officer, for example, that you may have a need for support, then they are duty bound to offer you an assessment. Now, of course, you can say no to it if you prefer, but there is a duty there to offer a carer's assessment if it appears that you might need some form of carer support. Okay, so those are some of the big advantages, I think, of carer's assessment. Moving then on to what you can expect of the process. Well, carers assessments are usually undertaken by a social worker or by a care and support officer. So it's the local authority in your area that would be taking the lead in this regard. And more often than not, in these sorts of scenarios, there's the carer and the cared for person that would need to have their needs assessed. Okay, so these are two distinct assessments that we're talking about. So assessing my needs, if I'm living with dementia, let's say, as well as assessing the needs of my wife, who is providing care for me. Okay, so we're talking about two assessments, but of course they are very intertwined. And so in practice, what usually happens is the local authority would assess my needs first, and either at the same time or subsequently they would assess my wife's carer needs. Now, as a carer, you are entitled to have your assessment done separately to mine if you wish. And I mention that because, as we'll see later, bearing in mind that you're not obliged to provide me with care, you've now suddenly become my wife, by the way, in this example, even though you're not obliged to provide me with care. Sometimes, you know, when you're having conversations about this, there are often things that you might prefer to say to a professional that's not within my earshot. Okay, so you are entitled to have a care assessment done separately to mine. Usually, they're very much done at a similar time. There are all sorts of flexible ways of carrying out a carer assessment. So under the Care Act, there are all sorts of ways in which the legislation can be flexed. And the Coronavirus Act is quite interesting in this regard. And in fact, one of the key aspects of the project that we're looking at is what has been the impact of the Coronavirus Act in this area. But even without the Coronavirus Act, it's always been possible to offer a degree of flexibility in terms of carer assessments. So we're not necessarily talking about, you know, a social worker coming round to your house. This can be done over the phone as well as in person, or it can be done online, if that's an option for you. And certainly over the last, 15 months or so, there have been a sort of increase in the use of these sorts of remote assessments. So there are flexible ways in which this can be done. Under the guidance, you should be provided with the questions in advance. Okay, so you've got the paragraph there. You're entitled to expect the questions to be provided to you before the assessment. And that's important because you don't want to be thrown on the day with something unforeseen. It's always useful, isn't it, to know the sorts of areas that are going to be explored in that assessment. And also, and I'll say a bit more about this later on, in terms of identifying what your needs are, it might well be that you want to get some sort of evidence to back that up. So if, for example, your caring responsibilities are causing physical or mental ill health, and you've been to the GP and there's medical evidence to back that up, then it's useful to get that in advance. So getting the questions before the assessment is something you're entitled to, and it's always worth asking for. In terms of the, how long does this all take? There aren't any statutory deadlines. There aren't any legal deadlines in the legislation, but it should certainly be done within a reasonable time scale. Just to read a paragraph from the code or the statutory guidance, it says that it should be carried out over an appropriate and reasonable time scale, taking into account the urgency of needs and a consideration of any fluctuation in those needs. So there's no set timescale. It must be done within a reasonable period. But what you can expect, what it's perfectly legitimate for a carer to expect from a local authority, is some indication as to how long it is likely to take. And that will vary in different parts of the country. You hear some horror stories in some parts of the world as to how long this might take. But usually, without a pandemic, it can take something like 4 to 6 weeks. Okay, but as I say, it does vary, and it's always worth asking the question, how long is this assessment likely to take? So what is the aim of an assessment? Well, the first aim is to identify your need for support as a carer. Okay, so that's about gathering information, gathering evidence, and identifying what your support needs are. The assessment must also consider how sustainable your caring role is. Okay, that's both in the present, but also in the future. Okay, so how sustainable is this role that you're playing now, and what might be your potential future support needs to ensure that it remains sustainable. Thirdly, we're looking at what outcomes you want to achieve and the impact of caring, for me, on those outcomes. Okay, so those are 3 key aims. And the fourth, and obviously in practice the key one really, is to develop a support plan. Okay, so for the local authority to put together a plan of action, a support plan, to work out exactly what those needs are and how those needs are going to be met. Okay, and as I say, we'll look at an example later on. So let's have a look at the assessment process. As I say, this is usually, it can be quite a complicated and sometimes daunting process. And it's always very helpful if you're fully familiar with it, so that you can check that it's being done properly by the social worker or social care support officer, let's say, that might be involved. So there are 4 elements to this. Okay, assessing your needs, identifying which of those are eligible for support, formulating a support plan to meet those needs, and then fourthly, the issue of financing or charging insofar as that's relevant. So in the first place, as a social worker, I now have to determine what your caring needs are. And the first thing I will do is see whether the needs arise as a result of you providing care to an adult in need. Now, you know, for these purposes, that's not normally going to be in dispute. But from your point of view, as the person that I'm assessing, bearing in mind, it's often very difficult for us to identify our own needs. When you're preparing for an assessment, it's always worth thinking about what would happen without support. Okay, so ask the sort of what if question. What would happen if I didn't get help with X, Y, and Z? Is there a risk to my, or let's say your physical health or mental health? That may have already deteriorated, certainly during these lockdowns, but there could also be a foreseeable risk coming down the line to your physical or mental health. Without support, what might be the impact on your employment? What might be the impact on your relationship with others if you didn't get support? What about recreational time, free time? What might be the impact on that if you didn't get any support? And what might be the impact on your ability to provide care? What might be the impact on your your caring role if you are left without any form of assistance. Okay, so ask the what if question to try and identify in your life where your needs might be. And as I've said there, the more evidence there is, the better. And it might simply be something like you need a break from providing care. Well, have a think about how long you think that might need to be for. Is it a break of a few hours during the day, or are we talking about something lengthier, such as respite? It might be that you need information about what services are available. Many day centers have closed during the pandemic, so you might want to know about what is currently available, etc., etc. Okay, so identifying your needs that's the first key thing that the local authority will look to do. Now, that should then provide a list, okay? A list of what your needs are. And we could have all sorts of needs in life, but under the Care Act, it's only eligible needs that demand some form of service. Okay, so there's a difference between an assessed need and an eligible need. Okay, you could have 20 different needs that I've assessed, but only 10 of them might actually be eligible for support from the local authority or from other organizations. So what is an eligible need? Well, again, this is all set out in regulations. So your needs are eligible if, and this is where I'm afraid it does get a little bit complicated, your physical or mental health is or is at risk of deteriorating. Okay, so a need will be an eligible need if your health is at risk or if it has deteriorated. Or, and the word or is absolutely crucial here, or, you know, your health might be fine and not at risk. You might be coping in that sense, but you are unable to achieve any one of this list of outcomes. Okay, so it's one or the other. Okay, it'll be an eligible need if your physical or mental health is deteriorating or is at risk of deteriorating, or your health might be absolutely fine, but you're unable, without assistance, to achieve one of these 8 outcomes. And then the regulations set out essentially what are seen as key activities in our life. All right, so carrying out any caring responsibilities you have for a child, providing care to others for whom you provide care. And obviously that's usually going to be one of the key things that we're looking at there. Maintaining a habitable home environment in your home. Okay, so we're looking there at to what extent you're able to maintain a habitable home environment. Whether you can manage and maintain your nutrition. Developing and maintaining family or other personal relationships. Engaging in work, training, education, or volunteering. Making use of necessary facilities or services in the local community, including recreational facilities or services, such as golf. I'll come back to the golf course later on. And then finally, engaging in recreational activities, such as golf. All right, so there are 8 outcomes there. And if you have needs arising from your caring role, which means that you're unable to achieve any one of those, any one or more of those, then that is an eligible need, provided, and this is the second part, provided as a consequence, there is or is likely to be a significant impact on your well-being. Okay, so stage one, we need to work out what your needs are. Long list. Stage two, we look at the impact this is having on your health, or the extent to which you're struggling to achieve any one of those 8 outcomes. And for those, we then look at whether there is or is likely to be a significant impact on your well-being. And if you have that, then that is an eligible need. And the reason that's important, I will explain later on. Okay, now what on earth does well-being mean? Well, again, that's set out. So well-being includes your personal dignity, physical and mental health and emotional well-being, protection from abuse and neglect, control by you over your day-to-day life, participation in work, education, training, recreation, social, economic well-being, domestic, family, and personal relationships, suitability of living accommodation, and your contribution to society. So when we talk about, does the carer's needs have or is likely to have a significant impact on their well-being, that's what we mean by well-being. Again, notice it is pretty broadly defined. And again, that's important because the broader these concepts are, the more likely it is that you might have eligible needs, and the consequences of that I will explain shortly. Okay, so that's how local authorities will determine whether a carer has eligible needs. Now, the reason it's important is because under the Care Act, if I've assessed you as having, let's say, 5 eligible needs, then I have to develop a support plan that sets out how those eligible needs are going to be met. Okay, there is a legal obligation on the local authority to set out a plan that explains what those eligible needs are, how they will be met, who is going to meet them, and when is that going to happen. Okay, so if you like, this is a sort of operational support plan. It's a plan of action as to what is available, what might be funded or commissioned to meet those eligible needs that have been identified. Now, in a carer context, and obviously today we're focusing particularly on carers of those living with dementia, it might well be that your need can be met by services being put in to support the person you're caring for. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, if you need a break, then it might well be that that need can be met by us providing someone, a carer support worker, to sit with your partner, let's say, to give you that free time to achieve the outcomes that you want to achieve in life. Okay, so a sitting service is one example. Providing respite is another. So it might well be, and we can talk a bit about care homes perhaps later on, and the challenges that have been faced in relation to respite. But it might well be that your needs as a carer can be met by your partner spending some time in respite. It might well be that aids or adaptations can be provided. Maybe there's other forms of social work involvement that could be provided to the cared for person or some other facilities. So in short, some of your needs could well be met and supported and addressed by providing services to the person that you care for. Equally, your needs could be met and obviously it will depend on the nature of what your needs are, but it might be that your needs can be met by providing a service directly to you. Now, the statutory guidance gives some examples of this, and I'm going to read it out because it sounds wonderful. So what sort of services might be made available for the carer themselves? Well, relaxation classes. Obviously, this was written before the pandemic, but none of this has changed, right? Relaxation classes, training on stress management, gym or leisure center membership, adult learning, development of new work skills or refreshing existing skills. So you might be able to stay in paid employment alongside your caring role or take up a return to paid work. Pursuit of hobbies, and the guidance goes so far as to give examples, such as the purchase of a garden shed or purchase of a laptop so you can stay in touch with family and friends. So the key point is that a carer's needs could be met primarily in one of two ways, either to provide services for the cared for person and or to provide or offer services directly to you. Okay, and then the plan would be to put that together in a support plan that you can benchmark against, so you know what the needs are that have been assessed as eligible for support. You know what support is available. You know who is able to provide that support, and then you can use that support plan as a stick to beat others with if that plan is not followed. Also in this regard, and this is particularly important, I think, in a sort of COVID context, local authorities are encouraged to be flexible and to offer direct payments. So if your financial situation is such that you are entitled to paid services that are commissioned, if you like, by the local authority, rather than you having to self-fund them, then the local authority should consider the offer of direct payments, giving you the money that's needed to meet those needs, to pay for those services. And certainly in the context of COVID, local authorities are being encouraged to deal with direct payments flexibly. All right. So let's just move then on to money, and then we'll have a short break. So if your needs are to be met by providing a service to the cared for person, so let's say that the plan is to give you some respite or a break by providing services to your partner. In terms of financial assessment, it's your partner that would be financially assessed there. Now, as we all know, social care is means tested, and there are financial thresholds that will determine whether it is you that would be financially responsible for commissioning the service, or whether your finances are such that you're entitled to have the local authority pay for those services. Okay. Generally speaking, anyone that has over £23,250 will be funding their own services, but anyone that falls below that threshold may well be entitled to local authority funding of their social care. Okay. If the service, and this is what I want to stress really, if the service is directly provided to you, and that could be, you know, the purchase of the shed or the gym membership or the relaxation classes, right? Services directly provided to the carer. The local authority has a power to charge you for that, but they're not required to do so. Okay. And that is potentially quite significant. And this is where the idea of a false economy comes in. Often, it makes absolutely no financial sense to charge a carer, even if they have, beyond £23,250, it makes no financial sense often to charge the carer for the services we're providing to the carer, because you might well then choose not to have that service. Well, if you refuse that service, you are then without that support. That then increases the risk of carer breakdown. And of course, if you are then unable to carry out this caring role, then it falls back on the local authority to provide replacement care. And usually that is going to be more expensive than what it would have cost to pay for that relaxation class or gym membership in the first place. Okay, so that's what I mean by false economy. There's been a number of research projects that have looked into this, and the figures do vary, but it is crystal clear that £1 spent on carer support saves money, okay, because it's an investment in that invaluable role as a carer. So that's crucial, because you might well therefore find that you have a carer's assessment, your needs are assessed, there's a support plan in place, there are services offered directly to you, and it may not make sense for the local authority to expect you to pay for them. Thank you so much for all the questions in the chat, which is great. One of you referred to Luke Clements, and I entirely agree with that comment. Luke is the god of all things, but in particular carers' rights. And so what I've done, I'm not sure if all of you will be able to access this, but don't worry, because I can email it round with the slides afterwards. But in the chat, you might see that there's a PDF document there, which is Luke's entire book on carers and their rights. Okay, so if you read his book, highlight it, and use it, then you are, I think that's one of the best, actually, it's one of the best law books on carers' rights. So I would thoroughly commend that to you. Okay, so let's look at a bit of an example, and then we've got about 20 minutes or so to reflect on any questions that anyone has. Okay, so Mr. and Mrs. Parsley, they are 63 and 78 years old respectively, and they live together at home. He's employed part-time as an accountant. She has dementia. Usually, Mrs. Parsley goes to a day service for 7 hours a day for 3 days a week, whilst her husband is at work. The rest of the time, he looks after her, apart from 1 weekend a month when she stays at a care home to give her husband some respite. Okay, so he is the main carer, and obviously he's a carer for the purposes of the definition that we looked at earlier. But whilst he's at work, she goes to a day service, and 1 weekend a month, she goes to a care home and he has some respite. Now, during the pandemic, he's been working from home. The day service has closed, and the care home would require Mrs. Parsley to isolate in the bedroom for 14 days if she was to stay with them. And so because of that, they don't use that respite service. As a result, the caring demands on him have become significant, and he doesn't know what to do. You have husband and wife living together 24/7 without access to a day service, without any form of respite. And one Friday afternoon, he watches a carers' rights webinar. What a coincidence. Right, the following Monday, he phones the local authority to ask about a carers assessment, something that he's heard all about at the webinar. Over the next 4 weeks, a social care support officer, let me just say something briefly about social care support officers. They perform a really important role in local authority social care. They are not like qualified social workers, okay, so they don't have the same sorts of qualifications, but often in sort of routine cases, they might well be involved in this assessment process. All right, sometimes it's the social worker. You know, over the next 4 weeks, the social care support officer, an SCSO, assesses the couple's needs. Okay, so Mrs. Parsley's needs are assessed, and then so too are Mr. Parsley's. And so far as he is concerned, as the carer, the needs that he has have been assessed as, without support, his employment could be at risk, because the demands of the caring role are having an impact on his ability to fulfill his employment obligations. He's not sleeping well, which may require medication. He may need some help in that regard to help him sleep, because he's at his wit's end. The relationship between them is becoming fraught. He feels exhausted all the time, etc., etc. So the key thing really is that this is just an example of not an uncommon scenario, I imagine. And so they've assessed his needs. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to be offered services to meet all those needs, of course, because we then have to look at which of those needs are eligible needs. Well, there's a clear risk of both physical and mental health deterioration, which could have a significant impact on his well-being. In addition to that, this isn't necessary, but in addition to that, because it's one or the other, in addition to that, he's unable to provide care to her. He can't maintain a habitable home environment. He can't engage in work or recreational activities. Okay, so if you recall earlier, I was saying that if your caring needs result or are likely to result in physical or mental health deterioration, or, that's an important word, or without assistance, you're unable to achieve one of the outcomes, and that has a significant impact on your well-being, then it's an eligible need. So thirdly, the third stage is to then develop a support plan that clearly identifies what his needs are and sets out the plan of action, how those needs are going to be met. So in this example, as a carer, he needs someone to care for his wife, let's say for 4 hours a day, so that he can do his accountancy job at home. He also needs someone to care for his wife for 3 extra hours twice a week, because the golf course is now open, and that's recreational activity, which is one of the key outcomes that we're looking for. So he might need a total of 6 hours a week so that he can have a break from his role and play golf. In terms of his employment, he needs advice about how to request flexible working hours. Okay, so in this particular case, those involved felt that some of his needs could be met by making a request to his employer to see whether those working hours can be changed to make them more flexible, to help him fulfill his employment responsibilities. And rather than having to go out and not having the time to go out to do the local shop, it's identified that he needs some support to help him with an online food delivery service. Okay, so those are his needs. We've then identified which needs are eligible for support. And then thirdly, you have a support plan that clearly sets those out and basically what's going to be offered and how those needs are going to be met. The fourth stage then is, how is this going to be paid for? Because social care generally is means tested. Well, in this particular scenario, the couple's finances are above the threshold for local authority commission services. Okay, in other words, they don't qualify for local authority funded support. But with the help of the social care support officer, she's able to identify organizations or agencies that with reasonable rates could provide the carer that we're talking about, the support worker to sit with his wife for those periods of time. Okay, so ultimately, given the couple's finances, in this scenario, they will be paying for the support, but they have access to information as to what organizations are available, and they are helped to sort out those paid carers. The local authority also arranges for the employment advice to be provided to him directly. Okay, so this is an example of a service provided direct to the carer. And that will be provided free of charge, because it makes absolutely no sense to charge him, given the risk of false economy that I talked about earlier. And the local authority also arranged for the food delivery advice to be provided free of charge. Okay, so that's just a quick example. And it's mainly to sort of help set out the different stages of what's involved when it comes to a carer's assessment. So we've looked at the definition of a carer, because even though you might not associate yourself as a carer, it is a legal definition, and it's important to be aware of that. I was emphasizing that in law, there's no legal obligation actually to care for your loved ones. And so it shouldn't be assumed that you are able or willing to do so. Secondly, we've looked at sort of when to request an assessment. We've looked at the assessment process, and then we've had a look at an example. Right, so that gives us about 20 minutes or so for questions. Can I come to Debbie first, and then I'll have a look through the chat. Debbie, are there any sort of pre-submitted questions?
We've got a few pre-submitted, Neil, but I've also, I hope everyone can hear me. I've also been through the chat and I've collated them, so I can harness them for you, if that would help.
Yeah, super,
I'll
thank you.
ask them out loud. So first, just on this point, we've had a number of questions that relate to this point, which is, you know, if you have too much money and you're going to have more than the 23 odd thousand pounds for the means test, are you still entitled to all of this? So is this your entitlement, however much money you've had? And we've had a few people ask that in their own ways. And I think linked to that, and some people have linked it, is how can you access advocacy services? If you know anything about how can you work with advocacy services to help you establish your rights when sometimes local authorities or social workers don't seem very keen to do this.
Okay. Well, thanks to those of you who asked that question. So far as finances are concerned, stages 1 to 3 are available for anyone. Okay, so it doesn't matter whether you are a millionaire or living on benefits. Your entitlement to an assessment, so assessing needs, determining eligible needs, and the support plan, those 3 stages have nothing to do with your financial affairs, okay, and how much you have in savings. The financial side of things only becomes relevant at stage 4. So we've identified what services are needed to meet the person's needs, and then it's a question of who is paying. And it's only at that stage that the local authority would undertake any sort of financial assessment to determine whether, because of your level of means, you will be expected to self-fund these arrangements, or whether you fall below the threshold, in which case you may be eligible for local authority funded support, whether in part or in full. Okay, so and I think that's incredibly important because sometimes we hear that someone hasn't been offered a carers assessment because they would be a self-funder. That's entirely wrong. Okay, you're entitled to this assessment process. You're entitled to get all the advice and information that we've been discussing, regardless of your finances. Okay, finances only come in at the very end when we're looking at who effectively is going to be commissioning this service. And as I was saying, if the relevant service is being provided directly to the carer, shared gym membership, etc. There's going to be a sudden surge of sheds being bought, I suspect, after this. Then they could charge you for it, but when you look at the guidance, it really does make local authorities think twice, given the false economy. Okay, because if we are going to charge the carer for this service, then they might well refuse it because they don't want to pay for it. And then there's the risk of carer breakdown. And further down the line, it might be that the state then has to sort of step in and replace the care that the burnt out carer was providing. And that is going to be far more expensive than simply paying now for that service to the carer. In terms of advocacy support, under the Care Act, there is a Care Act advocate, which can be available for both the cared for person as well as for the carer. There's a sort of trigger, if you like, for that sort of advocacy support. And essentially, if, let's say, as a carer, you have substantial difficulty in being actively involved in the planning process, and there aren't any suitable family members or friends to help you with that. If you have a substantial difficulty in being involved in the process, then you're entitled to a Care Act advocate. Okay, so it's well worth knowing locally which advocacy organisation is responsible for providing Care Act advocates.
I guess, Neil, people might want to know how they would find that out. Does the local authority have to give that information out?
Yes, the local authority, like in the first instance, if you've got access to the internet, I'll just Google it because it's usually very easy to find that out. But this is a local authority commissioned service. So, you know, the social worker, let's say, or the social care support officer ought to be fully aware of which organisation locally is responsible for that Care Act advocacy.
Thanks. So just moving on to another group of questions, which is really about what if you disagree with what the local authority says or assesses, you want something and they give you something else, and linked to that, can they cut an assessment, particularly under COVID conditions, and require a reassessment? Can they, if you have an existing care package, can they alter that? But lots of questions from people who didn't agree with the needs assessments that the local authority had come up with.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So I think there's quite a lot to say about that, Debbie. I think that the first important thing, focusing in on the carer needs assessment, is that when we start looking at well-being, so what is the impact of this on your well-being? The guidance is very clear that we should assume that you are the best judge of that. Okay, so as a carer, you are best placed to determine what the impact of your caring role is on your well-being. And obviously, well-being is very broadly defined. So I think that's the first key thing to stress. The second is that so far as the law is concerned, it is the local authority ultimately that determines your needs. Okay, so you are best placed to judge impact on well-being, but it's the local authority's legal obligation to assess and determine which of those needs are eligible. Okay, that's a public body's decision. Now, it's not unusual to disagree in this regard. And of course, that's why I was saying earlier that getting the questions in advance and essentially being well prepared for the carer's assessment is so important, because the more evidence you've got of this need, the harder it will be for the local authority to say that that need does not exist. Okay, so it's about evidence. So far as the legal processes are concerned, of course, you can initially have this out, if you like, with the assessor. If they stick to their guns and there's still a dispute, then each local authority will have a complaint process that you would need to go down. Having exhausted that, if it hasn't resolved the situation, there is the ombudsman. You can make a complaint to the ombudsman. And in that regard, it's always useful, if you can, to flag up whether, and if so, how the local authority has acted contrary to the statutory guidance. So there's the Ombudsman service. That's a free service. They can investigate complaints of maladministration, as it's called. And that's how most complaints tend to get dealt with. Like, ultimately, the very final arbiter is the courts. There is judicial review available, but that is often complex. You're likely to need a lawyer to assist with that, and there's not necessarily free legal aid in that regard. So that can be, it depends on your financial means, of course, but that can be costly. But that's the process. Initially, make sure you've got as much evidence as you can get, if you like, to support your claim that these are what your needs are. Mention gently, if you need to, that under the guidance, you are, as an individual, best placed to judge the impact of this on your well-being. If all that fails, complaint. If that fails, ombudsman. And in a sort of, last resort sense, you could always approach a law firm that specializes in community care to see whether there's any merit in bringing a judicial review. There's lots of lawyers around the country that do that. As I say, depending on your means, you may or may not have to pay for it. And quite often that would involve, if they think there is a case, a letter before action, where the solicitors write to the local authority, set out the legal arguments, and sometimes that's enough to get it resolved. If it's not, then they might be looking at legal proceedings. So that was the first question. What was the second one, Debbie? Sorry.
So because of the Coronavirus Act and because of COVID, can the local authority cut what they were giving you, reduce the services, and force a reassessment where they assess you as having lesser needs? Okay, so there was, as many of you will be aware, there was a period, it lasted for about a year, during which local authorities were given the power to water down their responsibilities under the Care Act, what's known as easements. Now, those easements were only used or activated in 8 local authorities for relatively short periods of time. And that's what our research project is very much looking at. Now that's finished now, that can no longer be done. So the full force of the Care Act is back with us. But even over the last 15 months or so, in the other, I think there are about 132 local authorities in England. So even in the other 124 local authorities that did not trigger easements, in those local authorities, so the vast bulk of local authorities, their duties were not watered down at all.
Okay, so everything we've said today in those local authority areas applied equally throughout the pandemic. And what that means in practice is that if, for example, I'm living with dementia and I've been with my wife, let's say, we've been assessed as me requiring a day service. And let's say the day service had closed because of the pandemic, that need is still there. And so it then falls to the local authority to identify an alternative. So if I can't go to a day service, how is this need going to be met? And that legal duty to offer a service to meet those eligible needs remained throughout the pandemic and are very much alive and kicking today.
So Neil, I'm just conscious of time because you'll probably want a couple of minutes to wrap up. But I think one question that's very pertinent to what we're looking at, particularly with looking at older couples, is what if they both have need, they care for each other, but both have needs themselves? So how does this all work? A question posted. Yeah.
Okay, so in that sort of situation, they are both entitled, if you like, to two assessments. An assessment of their own needs for care and support, plus an assessment of their carer needs as well. So if they're sort of mutually caring for each other, again, this is going to be a very kind of intertwined assessment. But legally speaking, if I've got my own needs plus carer needs, then both have to be assessed.
What about people who are just embarrassed or stigmatized and don't want to admit to the local authority social worker how hard everything is for them because they feel socially obliged to look after their husband or wife? It's all very different. How does that work out in practice?
Yeah, and I think, you know, from a human point of view, this crops up a lot because, you know, it's recognized, as we've said, that you don't have to provide care to your loved ones, interestingly. And as part of the carer assessment, you know, we being, let's say, a social worker, we will be looking and asking about your ability and willingness to provide care. And, you know, it's going to be very difficult for you in that situation to say, well, I'm not willing, because we're talking about, you know, a loving member of the family. And so what I would tend to suggest in that situation is forget willingness, focus on ability. So the conversation is better taken down the line of, well, look, without X, Y, and Z, I'm not going to be able to do this. So it's less a question of what you're willing to do. It's more a question of what you're able or unable to do. And I think if you look at it in that sense, I think it makes it easier from a carer's perspective. And it also ensures that your needs are properly recognized and identified.
And just to say, Neil, and then you can close, but the carer assessment is independent of the assessment of the person cared for. You don't need both. You're entitled to in your own right.
Yeah, you don't need both. They stand on their own 2 feet. There could be, it is logically possible for there to be carer needs without the cared for person having their own eligible needs. So in that sense, they do stand on their own 2 feet. In practice, as I said, usually the needs of the cared for person tend to be looked at first, and then the carer's needs. So it tends to be done side by side, those two assessments. Because of course, ultimately, when you've got two support plans, they need to sort of click together. But equally, it's important to recognize that carers can have needs that are totally separate from those of the person they care for.
I'll say thanks to everyone on the chat. That's clearly all we've got time for. And Neil, I'll hand over to you to wrap up. But thank you for all the chats. It's been really informative. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Debbie. And yeah, thanks for, there's quite a lot of comments in the chat. So I think what we will aim to do is a bit of a frequently asked questions document. Perhaps I'll have a go at doing that this weekend, because I can see there are some other questions there that we've not had time to reply to. So I'll put a document together to address any other questions that you've got, and then we'll send that out with the slides and some other useful materials. So thank you ever so much for joining us this afternoon. I hope you found that helpful, and best of luck. Take care. Bye-bye.